Welcome, everybody. We're going to be moving into Unit 2 this evening. Unit 2 is still in the process of being built as I first record this video, so you can see the topic list appearing on my screen right now. Really are topics that are attached to Chapter 3 at this point. Chapter 4 will add additional topics to this unit and an additional assignment. My goal right now will be to revert to our textbook and follow along with the information flow that the author is providing and build the app as he's describing. Now, the first thing I will say as I kind of dig it back into the book here is um, the author does have a section in here where he says, go ahead, like he has a step by step, like create a new project, do this, do that, and he outlines the steps. Um, but then we kind of get to the point where we start to break away from that modality a little bit. He's not really saying do this, do that, and it's all in the reading. So when as you're reading it, you might go, oh, is he just talking about that, or are we going to code it? And a lot of times we are going to code it, and I'm going to kind of follow his format, but he really, his intent in this chapter really is to um, teach you how this works, right? Because understanding how it works gives you much more power when you're creating stuff to control your environments and some of the things. Now, what we did last time, if you remember in Visual Studio, is we built a web app that had kind of a template already set for it. And when we built it and then hit the run button, there was stuff already on in the browser and it looked pretty good, right? Here, we're going to start on a more fundamental level in this chapter where we're going to build an empty application, and whatever we add to it is going to be done mechanically, right? Instead of working with a template where Bootstrap's already included in their CSS and typography already present, right? We're not working on that level here. What is important though is as we're kind of stepping through this, to understand the pieces and how they fit together, and then to understand the terminology he's using too, because some of the terminology will be fresh compared to some of the things that you've learned in the past. Like when you're learning web stuff, we're often using the same HTML, CSS, JavaScript lingo over and over again, and you learn new technologies, but you're really kind of leveraging the same concepts, for the most part. Here, we're going to be looking at an application on a much more granular level that maybe you haven't looked at it before. But it does become really critical because really well-built applications are built like this, and having that granularity of control over the components becomes critical to building apps that run really fast and are multi-platform. And also, when you're working with a project team to build them, is much more feasible to work that way because of the granularity and individualness of all the little components that we add to it. So that's kind of the preface here. Now, he does kind of reiterate here that you need to have a development environment in place. At this point, I'm assuming the following, if you're watching this video, that you have some sort of C# environment with ASP.NET Core .7 libraries installed or higher, right? And I have been noticing that some of the students I've been helping, when they're installing 2022 at this point, this is May 20th of 2024, that .NET 8 is the default for Visual Studio. And if you want .NET 7, you have to explicitly add that. Now, as far as I know, everything we do here will work in .NET 8, but I haven't tested it. So keep that in mind. If you want to add the .NET 7 libraries, simply bring up your Visual and see if I can even spell it correctly here, your Visual Studio installer, and you can go in there and implicitly add those libraries if you want, right? That, for me, is always the only certain way to make sure that the stuff you see in this book is going to match up with the stuff you're coding. Right. I've run into this issue in the past where I would have students install, for example, .NET 5, and I was on 4.5, and then we wonder why the code looks different. Because hey, it's different. They're different SDKs. That's the why. And sometimes the languages change and evolve. And there was a really big jump when they went from and 4.5-ish, and there's little sub numbers that go with it, up to 5. And then when they jumped to 6, when .NET Core came out, even a bigger change, right? But .NET 7 is configured, is considered long-term support, LTS version. But .NET 8 is in that mode too now, I guess. So, however, our book is written with 7. So I'm just putting it out there. If you find differences in the code, blame Microsoft, not me. All right. But if you want to add those libraries, you can use the installer and find them. If you need help with that, just reach out to me and I'll show you how. All right. So that aside, what we did learn last time is that we were able to create an application really, really quickly. We chose ASP.NET Core web app, and it had a website basically pre-built, and we could just start dumping in content. Fantastic. For a lot of people, that's a wonderful thing. And there are many situations when you're working professionally that you want to start that way. Like, why the heck not, right? If you just want to get the content out there. It's the other pieces that become important, though, because sometimes the templates that are provided don't fit your paradigm, and then you need to do custom work for whatever reason, right? And that will be driven by the project needs themselves. Now, he does make a point here, right? And as you see here, I'm in section 3.1 on the book, page 31 on the PDF, and I don't know if that matches up with physical page numbers. But he talks about this concept that the way that they've set up the .NET Core libraries are that you always have this command line option. And whenever they say CLI, that stands for command line interface, by the way, right? So some people don't know that acronym, so I feel compelled to mention it. And there are ways that you can build an app entirely from the command line. Now, this is kind of an interesting thought because it's not the way that I normally have done any .NET stuff ever, right? Part of this is kind of to address the whole Linux crowd, to make this truly cross-platform. So like if you were, let's say, a sysadmin and you're deploying a .NET app on your web server and you need to build the code, like your developer gives you the code, but not the executables, you have that capability of spinning that up by, basically compiling it from the command line and pushing it then out to your web server and out to the world. Now, let's talk about that little piece here really quick, because this is a really important difference between building a web application with Node.js on the back end or a web application with PHP on the back end. Neither of those two languages, even though they're both very powerful and run on a server, are capable of building executable files. And I want you to think about that thought here for a second. There's a difference between taking a set of instructions and executing them, and a difference into taking that set of instructions and converting it into an exe file or a DLL file that is a binary file that you cannot read in a code editor. And there's an advantage to a binary file that a interpreted file doesn't have. So really what we're looking at is the difference between interpreted code and compiled code, right? .NET code that turns into executables and gets stored on a server will execute significantly faster than like PHP code that does the same thing, that needs to be read, interpreted, and then executed. And so, in other words, the compiled code is already on the machine level and saves a few steps basically in the process of making the code work. So .NET works like that, so that's the fundamental difference between this technology and some of the other ones. Are there other code environments that do the same thing? Yes. If you learn how to create back-end applications with Java, Java also compiles its code, right? And then you need a special thing on the server to make the Java code push out to the browser. But that also creates compiled code, which once again runs faster. Right? That's why we use real languages often to drive web apps as opposed to interpreted languages. which is better? That's really a matter for debate. I'm just putting it out there. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is we are going to start right away using um, both added packages to applications. So right off the bat, he's going to demonstrate this process. And the format these days for what we call serialized data or data transmission in most formats on most web servers and web applications these days seems to be the one that's highlighted here, which is JavaScript object notation. And this is something you may have heard of. But basically, it's a way to set up key value pairs using JavaScript formatting, right? Curly brackets, semicolons, commas, colons, and everything's in a key value pair. If you want to make an association to PHP, we call that an associative array in PHP. So very standard transmission format. And we will be adding a library right off the bat to enable web logging of an application using JSON. And JSON, for whatever reason, I don't know why it's become so popular. It's just become the tool of choice. Everybody thought it would be XML in the future, and that is used as well. But for whatever reason, that key value pair is very powerful. I don't think it's the most efficient transmission format, but hey, that's what they're using. All right. Now, we're kind of going back to like the mechanics of how like an app really kind of processes this stuff. And it says, he kind of reiterates, I described in the first chapter how, a request is made and how a page is served back. The thing that makes ASP.NET or any backend language preferable to using static HTML and JavaScript is the fact that it can work dynamically both with the user, their login, and their activity on the screen and what they're requesting. So it becomes dynamic. And that's much more possible when you have access to stored data and compiled code, right? So this is how this technology works. They do kind of show this graphic again, and this is where we're going to dig in a little bit deeper on it this week. Where we're really going to focus, honestly, is on the endpoint piece. But generally speaking, you go to your web browser, you hit a URL or click on a link, that makes a request to a web server. The web server receives it regardless of which web server software is running. And you'll notice in this graphic that they're listing IIS, that's Microsoft's web server software, Nginx and Apache. And Apache is kind of like the big one on the web, but a lot of open source platforms are using Nginx, which is kind of I don't know if it's a port of Apache or a copy of Apache, but usually on most open source platforms, those are the two that you see, right? If you're curious, on Prometheus, we're using Apache as our web server software. We recently had an outage with the server thanks to President Joe Biden, by the way, because he came to campus, we had to shut our servers down. And when we spun it back up, both of these pieces of software came up trying to claim the same port, and we couldn't get the server running. And we did figure it out. Christian and I figured it out and turned off Nginx, and then Apache was fine. IIS is the old way we used to deliver ASP.NET apps on the web. And up until Core came out, it was the only way to deliver ASP.NET apps on the web. And unfortunately, because of the way the technology works, that kind of hosting is more expensive. It must be on a Windows server. It must be running IIS. You have to build and compile the app on the server. All those pieces would happen. And man, what a pain, right? No wonder it's not the most popular, hosting engine. Right? Now, once it clears that point and it gets into the application itself, there's these layers that happen inside the application. The first layer is the fact that the application itself has embedded into its infrastructure this Kestrel web server. So it's kind of like, think about this, it's like a web server inside of a web server. So you're getting past the operating system web server, and then it's sending you off to this application, which in and of itself has its own web server to handle requests and process the application. Bizarre architecture, but that's the piece that makes it cross-platform. right? From there, we have what we call the middleware pipeline, as he's listing it. And it, notice what it does. It processes the request, logs some values, for example, and passes the request to an endpoint middleware. And the endpoint is what is the piece that sends the information back to the browser. It could just be an image. It could be a snippet of text, which is what we're going to see today, or it could be an entire web page, or whatever, whatever resource it is that you're pushing back to the screen. So the endpoint is what we're pushing back, right? That's ultimately what the user sees. The middleware really then is something in the middle that does something with the data or the requests that are necessary before you put the stuff on the screen, right? So that's kind of the thought. But ultimately, those are the layers that happen to get things up on the screen. They talk a little bit about this concept here of HTTP context object. And as it says, basically the server kind of uses this sort of as a place to put things temporarily when you're running a simple application. And the fact that, it operates in this manner, I think is kind of interesting. But it's always in play, regardless of like what we're doing. Now, they do make an interesting note here, and I think this is kind of interesting that Kestrel isn't the only server available. So in the old days, those components were really handled by IIS, the stuff that Kestrel is doing now. So in order to make it cross-platform, they built Kestrel to kind of manage it in place of IIS so that we don't need a Windows server to make it happen. But if you're looking for an alternative, you're just going back to the old approach, basically. That's the alternative. Which one is better? I guess I can't really answer to that because I haven't had enough experience doing the stuff on Kestrel to know, how much better it works. But per the readings I've been doing, it is supposedly significantly faster because it's much more lightweight. We'll see. All right, so we're kind of moving down now to here. They're talking about the fact that when we do start to worry about the middleware piece that handles kind of the processing and traffic directing and back-end tasks, that a lot of that is covered later in the book. It's those components that lead us to the concepts of MVC, how to make razor pages and having these what we call minimal API endpoints. In other words, where we can take other people's software that they've built, plug it into our application and utilize its functionality. And by the way, that is a really big movement, and it has been for a long time in app development, of how a lot of people build apps these days. They're not really creating anything from scratch. They're saying, hey, I need to add a map to my app. Okay, well, there's a mapping thing, and just add, and you just utilize the tools that are already built. Why would you recreate them? And then your real job then is getting them all to work together, as opposed to building them from scratch. All right, so that's kind of the lay of land there. Now, in this section, we are going to go ahead and, if he says the first, little does he know, we already built one with the template last week, but now we're going to go ahead and build one following his directions here. I'm doing this in Visual Studio 2022. It is possible to be done in other applications. I would prefer that you don't. I prefer that you follow along with me on this. All right. Now, once you get through the process of building an app, he's kind of building these things down into like these categories. So I feel kind of obliged to talk about them. He says that getting an application up and running locally typically involves 4 basic steps. So this is running on your own machine. Create the basic application from a template to get started, right? If you can use a template that gets you close, that's what you do, right? If you need to start from scratch, like what we're about to do, then that's what you do. Restore all the packages and dependency to the local project folder using NuGet. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting thought. when we are using other people's APIs, we have tools right inside of Visual Studio that allow us to search for the right API, select the correct version. Maybe there's alternate packages or whatever, and then install that in the project. We don't have to go out to the web and find it and download it and unzip it, and all that's handled internally in the product. If you do not do it through Visual Studio, then there are ways to do it through the command line. So if I was doing this on like a Linux server, I could do it through the command line, right? You can also do that through the command line on Windows. I really don't recommend it. Using the NuGet, and that's how I say it. And I hear people say Nugget, NuGet, whatever. Say it however you wish. Package manager, that's the way that you do it in Visual Studio. And even with using that tool, there's a graphical way to do it. And right inside of Visual Studio, you can drop down to the console and type in commands and do it that way too. Sometimes some of the tools don't exist in the graphical environment. I don't know how true that is these days, but in the old days, a lot of them didn't. And all the new cutting edge stuff, you'd have to type at the command line. I think at this point, probably all of it's there. I'm speculating a little bit. The next step would be building it. So building it, by the way, is different than running it. And that's why he's got it listed as two different steps. So you can actually take an application, load it up inside of Visual Studio, and then you can go to the Solution Explorer, right click it, and choose the build command, which basically runs the debugger, builds the code as an executable, and now it's ready to run. And if you haven't done this step yet, you can go into the binary folders for the project and find the executables after you do a build. Sometimes you do a build prior to actually running it to make sure you don't have errors, because you might go like, I think I have errors. Let me just try doing the build and see what happens, right? So that's kind of one of the why. The other aspect for doing a build is often when you're building and testing is sometimes you get things stuck in memory, like you wrote some code and there's some variables out there, some loops running or whatever, and the build kind of blows all that away and gives you a fresh starting point. So that's often kind of a band-aid fix for things. And then finally you run it, which means launching it in the browser, getting that internal web server inside of Visual Studio and the Kestrel server running so that your browser is now listening for requests in the form of a URL of some sort, a GET, a POST, or whatever, to make the code execute and do whatever tasks it is. So that's kind of what we're going to learn a little bit here today. Now, they do have, they're talking once again about the CLI here. You can build a lot of the applications from the command line, right? And not a recommended approach, but it's doable. And then there's certain types of ones that you're going to build in these various categories. So typically we will fall into one of these categories is the point. Minimal API applications, meaning it's kind of bare bones, right? We're not pulling in a lot of external resources. We're utilizing the code that we're writing. We might throw in some other stuff, but the back end stuff that's doing the work, there's not a lot of external stuff we're using, and that's why we call it minimal API. So we might use like jQuery or something like that, but nothing real heavy. Then you have Razor, and Razor is a language we're going to learn pretty soon, but it's a display language which allows us to control content to the screen in a different way than regular HTML. It has some like features that HTML doesn't have, but it also kind of is HTML at the same time, right? It's got its own syntax and output, patterns. Then we have the whole MVC things, and in the MVC thing, we've talked about that briefly. That's where we have M is the model of the data that we're interfacing with, whether it's a database or a text file or whatnot. The view, which is what pushes out to the browser, and then the controller, which is kind of really, we can start to think of that as kind of the middleware piece that does all the logic for the application. And that's a very common development style. And we're kind of brushing against that a little bit today, just a little bit, right? But we're not really in that mode. Usually when we do MVC applications, all of those components are in separate files, not in the same file. Then we have web API applications where, you know, unlike, let's say, the minimal ones where it's like, hey, we're using the mapping thing, we're using the logging thing, you know, we're using everything that's out there. And web API has its own kind of thing. In fact, when we got to HTML5, there is this thing called web API that's built into the HTML5 standard that allows us to do things that we couldn't do with previous versions of HTML prior to that point, such as create databases on the user's machine when they, so like, in other words, somebody pulls up a web page and you're creating a database on their hard drive, right? It's kind of an interesting thought. That comes from web API. That's just an example. All right. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to go to this next section here and build the app. So I'm going to follow the stuff here. Whenever we are creating a new project, a whole bunch of things happen. So I'm going to step through some of these steps. He's pointing to all this stuff on the screen. We've kind of done this stuff already, and I'm going to kind of point out the same things with my own terminology, but you can read it here as well. Maybe he says it a little bit differently. So take that with a grain of salt. So here's where we begin kind of the app build part. So I'm going to launch Visual Studio using 2022. I am going to create a new project. And then the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the filters up here at the top. And you can see I have mine preset, but let's say that you don't. Let's say you're landing in here like this. Now, whatever languages you have loaded into your installation, these will vary depending both on the operating system you're working on and its capabilities and how ambitious you were with the install screens when we installed this, right? So if I click on the language dropdown, you're going to see a number of different languages that are already listed here. And take a look. We got C, C++, F#, JavaScript, Python, query language, TypeScript, Visual Basic, and XAML, right? All of those are natively here with the installation choices that I made or tools that I added over time. The ones that are very specific to Visual Studio that are very Microsoft, centric, C#, F#, and Visual Basic are basically Microsoft languages, all three of those. The other ones are more generic languages. And truth be told, you can add language support for most things. There are some languages, the one I remember just off the top of my head is like PHP, for example. If you want language support for PHP in here, you're usually paying for a plugin. Don't do it, by the way, just code in a different tool. Not that you couldn't code PHP. Now, which language are we working in? Well, we're in C#, almost exclusively for this class. What platforms are we building for? Well, I'm not sure. Right. So we're going to leave that one blank because really, all platforms sounds best to me. Like if you're going to build a web app, why not make it available to all, right? And then the other thing that we're generally focusing on here is web. So I am going to choose the web thing only to filter down this list. And you can see that the list here is now much, much shorter than it was before. The one that he wants us to choose is ASP.NET Core Empty. The last time we chose the top one, which is the web app, that's the one that already had pages built. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and choose Empty. So you guys should do the same. Once you have that selected, click Next. I will make the point, though, right, that after you worked with a few different project types, that there's a list that develops here. And if you want to keep it handy, you don't want to search for it each time, you can pin it. Why not, right? You can see right now, I'm not too concerned about that because I don't have too many recent project types in here. Visual Studio is a fairly recent install on this machine. I always try to not install it on my personal gear, but here it is. Right. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And then we're going to come up with a name for this. Now you can call it whatever you wish. I really kind of don't care, but maybe it makes sense to name it what it is, right? So this is going to be Chapter 3. So I'm just going to call it Chap 3. You can call it whatever you wish. I had already chosen a location to save my work. I'm going to stick with this, by the way. And I want you to notice that it's on my G drive, which at least on this machine is my Google Drive. I will make this special note here. when you're working with Visual Studio and storing your files on a cloud drive, cloud drives that are loaded up on your personal equipment will try to auto sync with the server the moment you hit save. So the moment I hit to update the project, it's going to try to save to the server, and Visual Studio may read that, or often does read that as, hey, the file just changed. And I'll show you what happens like when you make that choice. Ultimately, really the best place to store your work is on your regular hard drive in a non-cloud drive location. And this usually defaults, by the way, and I think this is important to note. So like if you were looking on your hard drive, it would go to your users folder, your account, and then it would, oh, I don't even know. It's like a repos folder that you don't even see. It probably is like under app data or somewhere like really cryptic. And it's not a normal location where you would look for your stuff, right? And that's where it likes to store things. I like to put things where I can find them. That's my choice. Cloud drives make sense to me. The other option then would be GitHub, right? So like you use a repository instead. I'm not thinking we're ready for that quite yet, but we'll probably hit upon that too. Now, last time I recommended that if you're building a simple project that you can check this box here to place the solution and the project in the same directory. I am not going to do that this time. I'm leaving it unchecked. Why? The author is doing it that way. So I just want to follow his pattern. So that way, when I look at his sample code and my sample code, everything all lines up. Right? That's my why. Right. Normally, when I know it's a simple project, I check that box. Right. Why would you not check the box? If it becomes complex. It's simple as that. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next. On the following screen, here's where I want to differ a little bit from what he's asking us to do. So like he's asking us, right, to ensure that HTTPS is checked. And I'm going to ask you to ensure that it is not checked. Right. So I'm going to counter him on this. And here's the why. Yes, I think it's a good idea that when you're building a web application, you should build it for HTTPS, but it does two things when you check that box. The one is it adds a significant amount of overhead to the binaries that are being created. So it adds a lot of weight that we really don't need at this point. So in other words, the file project sizes are much larger because it carries all the components needed to build HTTPS. Secondly, when you launch the application, it will throw up an error message that will warn you and say, hey, this page is unsafe. And in many cases, you cannot even navigate to it. You will get on the browser level a warning where you can go in and you can accept the certificate and self-sign it and go through all these steps. And he explains how to do that. If you want to go through that, okay, go for it, right? I'm going to tell you it's not worth the hassle because every time you launch, it likes to use a different port number, and sometimes it'll ask you to reestablish the same certificate you just added yesterday. Maddening when you're building. So my strong suggestion is to leave that unchecked. If you're building this for real, you're really going to deploy it, check that box. Can you add it in the aftermath? Yes. Right. So let's not worry about it until we're deploying. So I'm unchecking. We're also going to leave the Docker unchecked. But if you wanted to create an application that was portable, that's the checkbox that you use. And chances are, for real deployment, you would check both of those, right? Docker is a really common way to push an app out there. The other thing that we're going to suggest, and I'm going to see like, what does he ensure do not use is unchecked. And I'm making the same choice here, right? And it kind of does a little bit the opposite of what you think it does, because I think last time I checked it and it put the top level namespace in there. Here I'm going to uncheck it and we're not going to see that, by the way. So all of those should be unchecked. I'm using .NET 7. I think I don't even have .NET 8 on here. So if you have .NET 8 and you don't have .NET 7, I guess just go with 8 for now, right? But the examples are in version 7. Once you've got those choices in place, go ahead and click create. and it will build out the application. And then immediately I get this box. Right. And I made a little posting in Unit 2 about this. And so what's happening here, here's what's happening. I just created this file, it got written to supposedly my hard drive, but in reality, like I said, my G drive is actually my Google Drive. It does physically exist on my hard drive here. And actually, I'm going to correct myself. It doesn't actually exist on my hard drive here. It's not an actual file. It's out on my Google Drive at school. And so the moment I create it, it's writing itself out to the cloud, which Visual Studio reads as the file changed. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ignore it for now. All right. If that is troublesome for you and you hit reload, what's going to happen is every time you make a change to your project, that screen is going to come up again and annoy the heck out of you. So here's the fix. You're going to go to the tools menu. You go to options. You'll go to documents, and then you will uncheck this box if this becomes an annoyance, right? So it says detect when file is changed outside the environment. And so in other words, if your server's writing it up, every time it writes it, the timestamp changes, and that's considered a change, even though you didn't change the content. So if it becomes problematic, come in here and uncheck that, and you'll be okay. But just make sure you hit okay. I'm going to leave it alone for now because I don't anticipate any problems. But hey, who knows, right? Right. The app is created. And then we get this like kind of this splash screen here that shows, you know, some basic information, just kind of, hello, hey, you made an app, welcome, you know, but truly the screen's pretty useless, right? It doesn't really give us a lot. In the sidebar here, we have the Solution Explorer. So we're kind of looking at the Solution Explorer as kind of our spot to manage all the project resources once again. You will notice inside here some real key files, and we'll kind of follow the stream of the book here, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things. First of all, the name of the solution. I want you to notice that when I created the project, right, that project sits inside the solution. So you're actually seeing the hierarchy. So what it tells you is I could have a different project inside the same solution file. It is not unusual to have multiple applications that are related to each other, working together, that are all part of the same construct. That's why that is what it is. As we start, this will be the way it will typically be. This is not a file and folder listing. This is a project hierarchy, is a better way to look at it. You'll notice that they'll have everything from connected services, nothing is connected. But if you had like a database or something like that, it might be listed there. If there's dependencies, whether we have different frameworks or other tools, they'll be listed there. The properties, well, here there's a file, and you guys noticing the format of this file? It's a JSON file, right? So let's click on it and take a look. All right, so I'm going to click, and heck, I have no idea what this stuff means, right? I do, but when you look at it at first, that's the thought that comes into your head. But it actually doesn't take a lot to figure it out. If you notice kind of the syntax of it, that it's key value pairs, you can start reading through all the different stuff. So notice we didn't configure HTTPS, so there's no port number attached to SSL, right? When we launch the web server, we already know which port it's going to take. By the way, every time you create a new project, it's going to grab a different port address on your machine. It's for the internal loop back. And anyhow, so some basic settings here. There's another area here. We have the app settings JSON. This is going to get tweaked in just a little bit, and I'll show you how, right? Allowed hosts, star, what does that mean? Any, that's a wildcard. Then we have ones that are related more to the development settings, because we are in development mode and not in production mode, right? So here we have just some basic settings. Then finally, we have our program CS file. And I want you to notice how different this looks relative to the console app that we had before. So we have a couple of different little pieces in here. Um, and we're going to talk about these as we go. And I'm about to jump back into the book, but I'm going to run this to show you that it runs. So if you've gotten this far and able to follow along, just go ahead and launch the project. You can hit the little play button. You can also press F5, by the way. You will notice as I'm talking that it does load my default browser with Hello World. Okay, thank you, Microsoft, for doing that for us. The other thing that you'll notice is down here is that there's a console window that's running in the background on the command line level. And you notice like right now what it's doing, it's just sitting there with the cursor flashing. And really, truly what's happening in the background is that Kestrel web server is running. I want you guys to notice this is the chapter 3 exe file. It says so right here, right? So we created a binary. That binary is running. That binary contains that web server that's sitting here listening, waiting for the browser to do something and then act on it, and it will get logged here in this window. So this is basically the web server running in the background right now. You will notice if you read this carefully, it tells you what port it's listening on. So it's listening on localhost port number 5063. Application started, press Control C to shut down. Which environment are we in? We're in the development mode right now. We're not in production mode. And then which thing are we running? This is just internalized in the log file. I do want to stop this running right now. So I am going to make sure I click in the console window, and then I'm going to do Control C, which shuts the server down. The web page is closed, and now I can go back to coding. And so that's kind of a typical pattern here. All right, let's jump back over to the book, and we'll keep flowing on this. All right, so hopefully you had that success where you were able to get the application loaded and running, and you got your hello world up on the screen, and you feel like you've accomplished a miracle. Not quite so much. Not as cool as what we did last time, right? With the template. They do make a point here of talking about the command line once again. So if I was, for example, looking to make a new solution file from the command line, here's the command for it. Making an empty web app, right? So you can actually use a little prefix on it if you wish. Or if you wanted to add the new project to the solution file, you can do all that from the command line. Kind of interesting, right? And once again, I don't know if this is an afterthought on Microsoft's part, because I certainly never, ever, ever did ASP.NET this way in the past. But I think once again, it's addressing kind of the Linux world and the open source world by use of that. They do talk about building the application. So let me show you the process of doing that. So if you just wanted to compile your code without actually executing it, you can very simply come up to the file here at the root level, right? So you notice I can be on the solution level, or I can be on the project level. And there's a difference, because if I'm on the solution level and I right click, I get build solution, which means it will build each individual project and compile the code. If I'm on the project level and I right click, then I just have a build command, right? And what does build do? It debugs the code, builds an executable that will run this. There are times where if you build something complex and this happens and things just aren't working, or something weird is happening, sometimes we do what we call a clean, which is it gets rid of the old stuff. It clears all the memory registers that were used by the application during the build process, and then you can build it. If you hit rebuild, first it cleans and then it builds. And often, you know what? That's maybe the better choice. Right? So I'm just kind of putting it out there. So if I just want to compile my code, I'm just going to do it just to show you that you can. I'm just going to do build. You'll notice down here in the console, it does give you a message. Build, succeeded, failed, up to date. And what it's really telling me here, up to date means it's like, well, I don't need to build it. You just built it and it didn't change. See the difference, right? If I do a rebuild, well, then it will actually do it, right? Now it says one succeeded, zero failed, zero skipped. And what you want to see is succeeded, right? Or it's going to say up to date, meaning it really didn't need to build anything. Nothing changed, right? So these are just helpful things to know. We kind of do some of this stuff in like Java, and maybe you've had that experience where if you have problems, sometimes you do clean and build. Here it's build, clean, and rebuild. The next thing that we're going to talk about is this NuGet package manager, which is the tool that Microsoft's built into this product that allows us to add components and APIs and libraries and all sorts of stuff. There are ways, by the way, to do this stuff from the command line, including, you notice the restore, build, and run commands. The restore, by the way, is not related to compiling. It's actually related to, like, if you move a project and you want to add the libraries that might be missing, you do restore, and it looks up in the library where they are and downloads them and installs them. Normally what we do when we're building apps, by the way, is very often we're looking for certain components to add because we need certain functionality and we don't want to create it. And then NuGet package manager is just a really quick way to kind of make that happen. They, at this point, are running the app. We already did that, so I'm going to kind of scroll past that. They do have a little tidbit here. So the bottom of page 39, if you did configure it for HTTPS and you get that warning, hey, you got to install the certificate or whatever, he's got a whole little thing about how to do it. The proper way to really do it is to install the certificate on the operating system level. But most of our browsers intercede at this point. And the experiments that I did while testing is when I used HTTPS in development mode, it tried to make me install the certificate every time. It's maddening, right? And then I'm like, hey man, I'm just trying to build an app, leave me alone. So I just went back to HTTP mode, and I highly strongly recommend that you guys do the same thing, at least for the preliminary steps. All right, what I want to do at this point, and he kind of continues on here, but I want to go back to this NuGet thing and kind of explain how this works, because one of the things that we're going to do is we are going to add JSON dependencies here for logging purposes. And so I want to address that. So I'm sorry that I'm bouncing around so much, but the theme right now is the NuGet package manager. So the first thing I want you to do is let's go back over to the project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and basically add a package. Now you can trigger the package manager a couple of different ways. My favorite kind of default go-to, right? And I think you guys will discover this often with a lot of this stuff in this product, is instead of going to the menus and looking around going, where is it? Right? Because I never seem to find it that way. I just go right to the project, and you can do it on either level. I can do it on the solution level or the project level. I'm doing it on the project level. I'm just going to right click, and then you're going to notice here that there's an entry that says manage NuGet packages, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And then it brings up this tool inside the product. And right now it will default to the packages that I've installed in my project, which right now is blank, nothing in here, right? However, if I go to browse, I'm just going to click on browse. I'm going to let it load up its stuff automatically, because what it's going to do is it's going to put up on the screen every possibility that is available. And I want you to also to notice that there's different repositories for these as well. So NuGet.org is kind of the default, but they have like offline packages and you can intermix them. I tend to leave this alone and leave it there. There's one that they want us to install, and I'm just trying to like find the name of it so I don't like, and it's like the Newton one here. I don't know where he does it. Okay, so I guess I'm really going out of sequence in this video, so I apologize. But all right, so let's just scroll down there then and take a look. All right. What he wants us to install is this one called Newton Soft JSON, right? And you notice that what it's going to do is it's going to add to one of our JSON files the setting for this package, saying basically in the repository of how we build the project, we're adding this to the project. We require this tool. All right, so let's go through the process of adding it here. So I kind of know the name of it. So I'm in the browse tab and I'm typing Newton. I don't remember the rest of it, but I remember it's a JSON thing. And there it is right up at the top. And it's newtonsoft.json. This is a very common one. And it says a very popular high performance JSON framework for .NET. And what I'm going to do next, and I want you to notice here as I hover over it, it's got a little download thing right there, right? I'm going to click on it, and then in the side panel, it brings up a bunch of information about it. You can, in some cases, choose the version you want to install. And I think that's what's kind of interesting about here is they're listing older ones too. So sometimes, okay, sometimes you're trying to fix an old project and you have to install dependencies that are old because things change. But you notice that they're recommending here that you don't go with any older version. Why? Because you're vulnerable in some way. They might be hackable, right? Right. So we're going to go with the latest stable release. It gives you all this stuff, right? It tells you what other libraries are dependent upon it. Tells you like where it came from, what the license is, if you want to go to the website and read up on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's all there, right? But I'm going to go ahead and just click install. That's going to take a moment here. And then you can see that it brings up a little box and it says it's about to make changes to the solution. It's going to install this particular thing. I'm going to go ahead and say apply. You might also choose to say don't show this again. That's up to you. Your choice. Now that it's installed, notice that the package manager recognizes it's installed, changes its interface a little bit, and also gives you the ability, by the way, to uninstall it from here. So you don't have to like know any fancy command line stuff or anything like that. However, if you were so inclined, you could do that installation from a command line. And here's the command for it. Right. You can also do that from within the product, where you go to a prompt and do the NuGet command line. And once again, I don't recommend that approach. I like using the NuGet package manager for a lot of different reasons, and you can see why. It's just easy and convenient. And if you're using Visual Studio, it is just the way to do it. So now we've added that component to our project, so now we can utilize it. All right, I think this is a great point to take a break. So I'm going to pause the video here. We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and continue. All right, back from our break, and we're going to roll here. I'm going to go ahead and jump back to the book just for a second here. Now, they're making a point that once you get this package installed, that you will notice in the project settings that you have a new entry. So let's see if that's actually true. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio here, and I'm going to go ahead and close the NuGet package manager. But then I'm going to notice here that when I look at the project root, and you'll notice it has basically an XML file that holds its settings, that the package that we just added is listed here with the version number, and it's listed as a reference. So now it's registered with the project. And this is an important step. So whenever we add tools, that's the method in which we will add them. Right? And what we add is up to us. And when we start with a blank project, there's nothing added, right? It's all on us to decide what that is. When we choose one of the other pre-built templates, you will notice some things are already added, like jQuery and Bootstrap, for example. Those are packages that you can add as well, those types of things. And of course, much more advanced APIs are also available. All right. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that, when we were playing with the console apps, we were kind of looking at these, what we call top level statements. And when we created a console app, it created the namespace and the class, and then, the executable, main method. Um, and this type of code in many ways will still exist behind the scenes, but when we're not using the top level statements, really what that means is it's kind of excluding some of these naming conventions, and I'm trying to highlight them here, that what will it exclude, and these are all considered top level statements, because if you take a look and compare like what we did last week, right, when we were building a console app, and those things were all there because that it makes it more like a Java program, for example. And then we compare it to this, where it's just like, where is all that stuff? You know, the reality is that stuff still exists, but we're not seeing it because all we're really concerned about is the executable part of it, which is what's here. This is the stuff that's inside that main method and is just executing. Does that mean we can't add stuff to it? No, no, we totally can, and we will in just a moment. Um, but this is kind of interesting because this is considered kind of like the base level of the application and what is steering it and driving it. And so if you look at this thing, they are pulling in this web application library. They have some sort of a function that kind of gets it going. They're applying variable names to it. So they have a builder and then they have the app, right? And notice that the build actually does a build command, which makes it alludes to this terminology we've been using, which is it compiles the code and gets it to run. So when we launch, what happens when we launch this application, right? More importantly, think about a web application that's out on the web. What happens when we launch a web application in reality? Does it launch every time we hit the page? That's not how a web application really works. The web application is up and running, and then all the other parts of it do all the interactions. So in other words, when we go and we hit an app on the web through the browser, we're not starting it at that moment. That thing is already running. We're hitting it while it's running. What these commands do is they get it running. How often do we do this? Hopefully not often, right? When are you going to, relaunch the app? Well, maybe you made some changes to it and you're going to re-propagate it, right? The ideal though is that it doesn't go down, or if it does go down, it doesn't go down often. But so the build does happen and then it runs. Now, in terms of breaking down some of the other components here, right? And so they're kind of giving us, examples of how C# works. All right, so if you're wondering what those commands are, so here's some explanation. So the first command creates a web builder, application builder using the create builder method. We kind of talked about that. The second one builds and returns an instance of the web application. So that's kind of an interesting thought right there, right? Because it's object oriented. So does that mean we could spin up multiple instances? Yes. Pretty weird, right? So I could run this on different web servers with different port addresses or whatever. Okay, so that's kind of a weird thought. Then we have this one that says, this one actually defines an endpoint, right? So it says defines an endpoint for your application, which returns hello world when the root path is called. So whenever I hit the root of my application, it's going to say hello world. Weird, right? And notice that it's mapping it to a get. Okay, so we'll talk about that too in a sec. And then after it's got everything all figured out, then it runs the app. So it builds it, it sets up some, endpoints basically, and then it runs, and then it's sitting there listening, waiting for it. And right now, all it's going to react to is hitting the root URL. That's all we've set it up for, is to hit the root URL. I want you to notice here, if you guys have taken the Java 2 class, you'll recognize this is what we call a Lambda expression, right? Where it's kind of like a little pointer, and basically what this truly is it's an anonymous function. It's unnamed, but it's still a function. What does that function do? It serves out hello world, a snippet of text. And normally this would maybe be like a function call to, or a program call even. Um, Now we're going to talk a little bit about the gets and stuff and posts. Um, but there's kind of some interesting things that are happening behind the scenes here too. So there's every time your app runs, what are those other tools at the top do? Well, the web application builder first loads all the values from that JSON file, all the settings. So it loads up your configuration. That could also include things like, for example, if you have connection strings to a database, and you can see they say that here, that it will load that too. So that's a very common thing to happen in an application, is that you have a connection string for your database. That's in the configuration settings. It'll also turn on the logging services so that you can keep track of what's happening in the application. Any services that we need, whether it's a database connection to a different piece of software, pulling in an API, whatever, all of that's loaded as well. And then finally, it launches the hosting component, which is the internal Kestrel server, is launched by that too. So that's what this piece does. It configures. From there, we have the build, which then launches all the other code. And then we have two different types, right? And we looked at this in the graphic. We have the middleware, which is all the stuff that we kind of don't see, that does all the stuff behind the scenes, directs traffic, connects up to things, handles the logic, does a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe even dishing a file to the screen, or as it says here, handling errors, right? And we're going to look at that more in chapter 4. And then we have the endpoints, which are basically how a response should be generated for specific requests to a URL in your app. So in other words, right now we have one in place, right? This one, which basically, in this case, that's the root URL. So whatever your application website URL is. And then what does it do when we hit that? It loads hello world. Now, what's kind of interesting is they're using this thing called map get. And we should talk real briefly about this. And if you've taken maybe the intro level programming classes with me, and I'm trying to get back to my regular browser window here, I do this thing where, I could do some sort of like weird search, like something like this, right? Since that was playing in the background before. And I went to Google and I typed something into their form and I pressed enter or search or whatever. In the URL, if you look at the URL really carefully here, you'll notice that there is a search query, right, that's happening, where they're searching for the two terms that I just typed in. And you can see those two terms right here. And then all this other like weird tokenized whatever. I don't even know what that is, right? Some weird Google token about this. Now, what's fascinating about this is this URL is in the form of what we call a GET, meaning when we are processing information inside of our web app, a GET will take the contents of the information that we're processing and dump it into the URL. So it's actually visible in the address bar. Interesting. That's called a GET, by the way. If I do it, and let's say I create a HTML form and I switch the method from GET to POST, same information is transmitted, but it is obscured from the URL. So for example, if I go and I do a login to a website, that's always done with a post, because the last thing I want is my username and password in plain text in the URL, right? So a post obscures stuff in transit from the address bar. A GET shows the stuff in the address bar. And so what they're really saying here in the book is that there's, basically this verb, right, as they're calling it. And I don't know how that highlighted, and I can't unhighlight it, but whatever. But the verb is actually get. And there's also, and I think they mentioned it here somewhere, that you can do a post, right? And somewhere here they mentioned that, right? oh, they say it right here. The second most common is post, which is used to send data to a server, such as when you're completing a form. And that's really considered more secure. If you're doing a Google search, well, okay, that's not really also secure, right? So it's okay that we do a get, right? So get the post, but when you do a get, it shows in the address bar, and that's usually where we start. Right? So when we're starting to map things, and this is kind of a different way to think for web applications, because so far in web applications, the way that we've operated is what we see in the address bar mimics the file and folder structure where the web pages are stored. That's not how applications work, though. The URL in an application now becomes a way to direct traffic in the application and call different application features. It's kind of like, you know, hitting a control panel and saying, hey, I want to manage my account, right? And so I have a URL set up that and I can set up a link for it too, that takes me to that spot, but it's not really a file and a folder. It's an application trigger to trigger a certain piece of code that happens to manage my account. So it's no longer file and folder. This is an important concept here, very important concept. Right. So we are in control of that as the coders. And what you decide to do in terms of like building your app will be once again relative to the app. So in other words, if I want to create a URL that's going to manage, a list of products or something, I control that URL. What the URL is that triggers the piece of code, that's on me, right, the developer. And hopefully you're naming it in a way that makes sense relative to the application. That would be the hope, right? So they're pointing out here that when we build an app like this, and it's empty, right? And we don't have any stuff in it. This is typically the pattern that we use here. So let's just take a look at this pattern. First, we create the web builder instance, all right? We register all the required services, for example, the JSON thing. We then call the build to build the app, to execute, they'll create the executable. And then if we have any middleware directives, any logic that directs traffic to other parts of the app, we put in that code. Then we map the endpoints. The endpoints would be the pieces that handle the custom URL. So if I have like account manage, that's an endpoint. Where does it take us? Well, depends, right, where we'll go. And then ultimately, once we've established all that logic, all those instances, all the thing running, and the code is turned into a binary, then we run the application. When it's running, what does it do? It just sits and listens for a request to come into the browser with a certain path in the URL, and then that executes the code in the app. It's no longer file and folder. All right. Now we are operating on a kind of simplistic level here, right, at this point. But what we're going to do next is we're going to add some of the functionality we see here, and we're going to just do this manually, right? So this code that you're seeing on the screen, I'm going to start dropping this in piece by piece. If you guys have already tried this at home, great, fantastic. If you haven't, I will do you a solid. I will copy and paste the code into the chat to save you a little bit of time. Or if you wish, it is kind of a, character builder to type it into. No harm done. You can play with the IntelliSense of the code and see how it works. But I'm going to go ahead and put in the using statement to start with. So the using statement, what we've already learned is this is basically like an import statement in Java. We're pulling in a library that has certain functionality. This comes from the .NET Core libraries, and we're going to be logging our application. So let's go back to the Visual Studio here. So up on the top, add some blank lines. I'm going to just start typing using, and I think it's Microsoft. So it's one of their libraries here. And of course, I failed in my typing here and hit the wrong key. So now I'm fumbling. You got to spell it correctly. Right. And I want the IntelliSense, right? Microsoft.asp.NET Core, and see, it happened again. I'm not sure if I'm like in like insert mode here or something, but and then we are going to bring in HTTP login. We're going to terminate the statement with a semicolon because we are working in C#. You don't want to type it, right? The advantages to waiting, here it is in the chat. Sorry, YouTube people, you didn't get that. You must actually suffer and type. From there, and I do have some cheat sheets here that I'm working from. They want us to add one other piece, and that piece right now is this one here. So you can customize feature by adding or customizing the services of the application, and that's what this line here is about. I do already have this copied, and so even though I've added the library, I technically have not added the functionality yet until I add this code. Once again, in the chat for the people in the session. Right. So now we're going to, from that library, we're going to add the logging services, and it's got its own little Lambda expression in here. And we're logging stuff. So like as stuff happens in the app, we're creating this capability now of storing that information. I want you to think about this, right? This app has its own web server built into it. And that web server, every time it does an interaction, is going to track those interactions. This is a powerful feature, right? Because if something goes right, you see it. If something goes wrong, or you got an error, you see it, right? And you can backtrace. So most web servers do this, by the way, but here it's being implicitly added. They have a little snippet of comment here, so you can add this if you wish, but you know, about the next thing. It says that the following filters already configured, right? And it shows you where it's configured. Now, we didn't really look at that very in depth, but that's over here, right? And that's where it would normally be added. So let's go back to the program file here. That should already be configured, but it won't be configured until we run it, by the way. All right. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add another endpoint. Now, they also had an if statement, but they kind of do this after the fact, and you know, it doesn't really kind of matter when we do it, but I'm going to do this piece here. And I'm going to grab the code right from here. And I hope that doesn't create like a little PDF output. In fact, I'm going to test it in the chat window before I send. No, that's actually all right. All right. So let's talk about this little snippet of code here. We already have an endpoint for the root URL. So when the application runs and we're at the root of it, it's going to say hello world. Here we're adding a URL that is /person. So when somebody goes to our app and goes to the person URL extension or whatever, it's going to instantiate a new person object, which, okay, well, this is calling for an object to be created that we have not yet created in our code. So I'm going to put down here at the bottom, basically, and this is kind of like a class file. So this is a record, but we're basically setting kind of like a class. You can think of it as a class, okay, as objects and classes kind of thing. We're developing a person object that has two data fields, a string for first name and a string for last name. So when I'm calling the new thing to instantiate it, it now comes down here and looks. This could be a separate file also. That's probably actually the better way to do it. But here it's internal, right, to this program file. And we're instantiating a new person with the name of the author. If you want to have fun with it, put in your own darn name. And that's what I'm going to do. Right. Now that last piece that they're adding, and they're going to talk about this later, but I'm just going to go ahead and add it now. I'm going to copy this, and this is an if statement. I'm going to put this if statement right below the build statement, and it says if the app environment is development, and we already know that we're in development mode, right? We're not published on a server yet, so we're in dev mode, not production mode. And so it's going to check to see if we are, and if we are, then we're going to use the HTTP logging that we have set up. Right. So that's kind of the entirety of the code really for this chapter when it comes down to it. And I'm going to see if I can kind of truncate a little bit of the space here. Did you also notice that as we did that, and you can see I'm like kind of trying to get it to all fit on one screen here. And of course, I'm epically failing, but I'm trying, right? So there's all the code on one screen. What we have here are some things that happen automatically, some things that we kind of like typed in manually, but we're actually starting to put some real pieces in place now, and we are about to run this. Now, you notice what happened is I put in the using statement here, and you notice how this one kind of dropped in there too? I didn't type that in. It just kind of happened. So we're using the system, and I think it was when we added the person object that happened. It's either that or maybe it was the this piece here that
mine is different. I don't know if you hear me.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Mine says Microsoft.asp. Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.identity.
That piece added in automatically for you?
Yeah.
And you guys are both using version 8?
Yeah, it updated to the newest version.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to pause. Let me pause the recording here.
Yeah.
Real quick. So one of the things that's been happening here, and I noticed that, I'm copy pasting a lot of my code, right? And then I know that you guys both got a Microsoft ASP.NET Core.identity thing that in a using statement up at the top. And some of you were typing in the thing and some of you were maybe copy pasting, and I think everybody was typing. But I think what happens is if, for example, let's say I delete that, I don't have any code that's underlining red, right? So in other words, if I have a using statement and it's grayed out like this, what it actually means is it's not being used. So maybe as you were typing in one of the commands, and I'm being a little speculative here, you triggered some code that maybe you backspaced over or whatever. But this IntelliSense tool is telling me the one that's grayed out is actually not being used and really doesn't need to be there. Right? And ideally, whenever you're compiling anything, you don't want to add stuff that's not being compiled in. So I think the identity thing happened maybe when you guys were typing things in. If it remains grayed out, it can be removed. I think it's the general thing. Now, if you remove it and something like underlines red, well, that's not the right answer. So why don't you try that and let me know what happened, because I'm speaking kind of bravely and boldly on it, but I believe that's the case.
Yeah, when I delete it, nothing underlines red.
Okay, so then you're okay. But somehow it added it in, and then maybe you corrected your code, and the trail of it stayed. But typically when we're doing stuff like this, we don't want unnecessary using statements because it does add overhead to the build of the application. Right. I'm going to go ahead at this point and run this, and we're going to take a look at the little bit of a difference that happens now with this being the case. So I'm going to go ahead and do a build. All right. It's running. There it is in my browser. Okay. Here we have the console right in the background. And what we really added to this is the ability that if I add to the URL, once again, person, what it's going to do is it's going to build a person object and then feed it back to us as JSON. That's what it does. So when I typed in person, added it to the URL, it went into Visual Studio, found that path, and then executed basically this anonymous function. That's what that is, which built a new person object and then fed it back to us as JSON. Pretty interesting, I think. Now, if you want to play with this a little bit more, so I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop button here, right inside the product. You could easily ramp this up. So for example, if I want to do basically a copy of that, I could, for example, put in a new URL like person 2, right? And just to keep it really simple here. And then we can just do the same thing, but make a new person object. So let's say new person, and then, see if I can type here. And then semicolon at the end. So now when I run this, now I have two URLs I can hit that will pull back custom results, right? So I can go to person. Then I could add person 2. And you can see I have my other person. So I'm now already creating new endpoints for my AMP, right? So I'm doing, basically what is being asked, right? I'm just providing text on the screen. The fact that it comes back as JSON is happening because we added that tool in, which is serializing the data. So I want you to think about this, right? What we're really creating here, we're not dishing out a web page. We're sending information back to the browser. And the browser really doesn't necessarily know how to render JSON. It's just going to put it up on the screen as text. But if it wasn't a browser, maybe it was a different app requesting a piece of information, this could be received by the other app and then processed and fed into a database or driven to an application or God knows what, right? JSON is just the transmission format. That could just as easily be HTML. Just think about it, right? So this is really super powerful stuff. We're doing very simplistic examples right now with super powerful stuff. All right. Here's what we're going to do. We're kind of at the point in the class here where I think I've kind of covered all the materials in the chapter. And I think that maybe the part that's not working, and I guess I'm not even looking, is here. I'm not getting it to serialize in the console. Are you guys getting it to serialize in the console?
No, I did not.
How do you get, is it just the regular command line console? Oh yeah, here we go.
Yeah, because I'm checking mine here and I'm not seeing that to be the case. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to just pause the video here. Let's see if we can figure that out, right? Because that's a piece that's happening for the author that's not happening for us. So let's see if we can make it work. When we get a solution, we'll come back and record it. All right. So we're noticing a couple different things here and why that logging isn't working, right? So the first thing is that we have this little piece here. This is different from the code that we have right now, right? So it says web application builder equals this. So I'm tempted, let's get this line in here first. And by the way, if the server's still running, console, hit Control C to cancel it, or come back to Visual Studio and hit the little red stop button. That works too. So we're going to start like adding these pieces back in. I'm going to remove this. And actually, let's not remove it. Let's comment it out. That's probably the smarter way to do it. And we can remove it in the aftermath. And then of course, I copied it and it didn't follow.
Do you mind copying and pasting some of that code into the chat too?
Yep, right now it seems like my Adobe PDF thing is kind of locking up here a little bit. I'm trying to get some of the stuff off the screen here to see if I can.
Never mind, I got it.
Something. Yeah, my machine is. Not liking that. Let's see if I can do that again. One more time. All right. Well, now it seems okay. Okay. Yes, in the chat. And I think this time it came in with artifacts. So I apologize if you're getting artifacts. Here it is. Now, is this different than what we see here? No, the command is basically the same, but here we're declaring it as an object is the difference. Okay. All right, so that's the one difference. I think this line is the same, but I'm double checking it. Okay, so this line's okay. Next, we're going to add this piece, and I think this is the piece that's commented out. So let's see if that's the case. Yeah, it seems to be. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And I'm just going to paste this in. And it looks like this really should just be one line. Right. And truly, these are really one line of code. All right, so I'm going to delete this one. Let's just get rid of that. So now we got the first three lines are the same. Then we have the web application app builder build. All right, so here we're going to change var. We're going to use web application in place of var. And now you see it's underlining. It doesn't like it. And then all my apps are underlining red. So I guess that maybe isn't a good choice here. So there's some sort of a disconnect here between the author's code and ours. Now I'm looking, I think what's kind of interesting here is I'm looking at his.
Can you go back to your editor real quick?
Yeah.
So you have the var app equals builder.build. That needs to be web application app equals builder.build.
Right. But when I do that, it doesn't like it.
Let's see.
Mine isn't doing that, and I have.
Yours isn't doing it.
No, mine's not doing that either. So I'm going to the lines that you have.
That's what I'm looking through.
Yeah. So now I have to like look real carefully. This all looks okay. Then I'm looking at this line. You see what it's suggesting is a fix. Right. And so what it's doing is it wants to put it inside of a regular program structure. And so I could do that and let it work, or I could just stick with what I have. I'm tempted not to do that though. But you guys are telling me that you're not having that issue?
No.
Yeah.
Well, there's gotta be. Is it because of this?
Cannot implicitly convert type of web application to web application builder. Oh, take out builder. It's just web application. It's web application app equals builder.build, not web application builder.
In other words, that's the correct code. Yeah,
Good catch.
yeah, good catch. Thank you. And here I was about to like restructure everything. You know, collective coding works really well because somebody always spots it before you do. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have that piece in place. Let's go ahead and try to run it again. I'm doing a Control S to save, although that's not really necessary. Whenever you hit that run button, it's going to do it anyhow. All right, I'm going to bring up the console. Okay, it looks like now it's logging, right?
Mhm.
So every time something hits it, now what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to come out of full screen with that so we can watch the log, right? And like watching paint dry. This is what server admins do. So we'll put in person. Person 2. I'm just looking at like the guy's documentation on this, which is not great, by the way. But I think this is pretty interesting, though. So it tells us every time somebody hits the server, you know, that it's happening, right? What path they're requesting. We're using HTTP, not S. The method is GET. We're using HTTP to do it. I think this is kind of interesting. It's pulling up a favorites icon. Apparently so. Right. So it pulled up the path and it pulled up a favicon. We don't even have one, right? But it's kind of doing some sort of default. But then it is responding to my 2 requests. Now I'm going to jump back to the book because I kind of think like in the book when he was looking at it, I mean, he's basically getting the same response, right? Yeah, he's basically getting the same response. So in other words, this logging thing, this is basically code that's happening in the background, right? So a good example of middleware, this is very simplistic, mind you, but a good example of middleware doing something and in the background, and in this case, it's writing to a log file, right? On a real web server, this is something that happens all the time. So like if we're looking at like, you know, our Prometheus web server here on campus and we have problems, we'll often go to the log files to see like, hey, when was it last working? What was last requested, or what stuff is failing, or you know, that type of thing. And of course, once again, very simplistic, but it is tracking every hit and what's being requested. So you can keep statistics that way, right? And most web hosts do this. So I think very fascinating aspect of it. Not sure what else I can really add here. I mean, but ultimately, you know, we're in the spot right now where we're starting to build stuff, you know, and, you know, it's kind of pointing to this optional service here that we added, and really talks about how all this stuff works. And I can let you guys like read that to your heart's content. The other aspect of it is they added the if statement. So really that's supposed to go at the end, but it only does the logging, you know, that call only does the logging if we're in development mode. And if you guys remember from looking at the settings, and I forget precisely where that was. Let's hit the stop button here. I think it was in the project settings. No, it was in the app settings, right? Yeah. Well, the fact that right here, right? So the app settings are for development mode. That's the only mode that's here, right? That's why that's triggering. So if we had a production mode, then we could have a different thing that happens, or maybe that doesn't happen at all. Why would you want to do this during development? Well, to see what's working and what's not. Right? Is it receiving? You know, is the software actually processing the requests that we're looking at? It does talk about how some of these tools work in particular, and sometimes I get really concerned about like the particular aspects of this, but not necessarily. But it does tell you here that it is tracking the content root path, the web root path, and the environment name. All of that is tracked by this particular little piece in combination with the web application builder. It does handle a lot of different things, and we kind of played with these little pieces here a little bit and got the response. And so really what they're kind of pointing out here is, what we really kind of built is when we hit the routing middleware and really those app calls to that path is really that, then relative to that path, we generate an endpoint and serialize the data and send it back. So that's what we kind of did. Now, in summary, for this particular chapter, this is the stuff that we did today. And I was probably right not to try to include chapter 4. We would never have gotten through it, so I never want to be too ambitious, but that's where we're going next. So we're going to go to chapter 4 next. The stuff that we did here in class, if you can get it to work. I just want to reiterate this for people. Most of you have had me in class before, so you know how to do this stuff. Because the console output is important for this particular project, I do want you to screenshot that also, right? So if you're doing screenshots, because that's part of the requirement here, the ideal way to do it, so this, I guess, includes how to do homework, right? Part of it is turning in screenshots. So make a new document, give me screenshots of your code. And in this case, it would all be in this one file. In fact, it's all on screen here. So I would do a snip of this, right? And I prefer that you capture it all like that. Right, show me the line numbers and the whole bit. Right, so that would be the one snip. Here it is in the snipping tool. I would copy that into my Word doc. I would also add a screenshot of the program running in the browser. Do I still have that up on screen? Maybe. Right, all the browser windows are closed, so I'm gonna have to relaunch it. Right. So you could show me that, but I think what would probably be more useful is to show me one of your endpoints, right, like this. So snip that too. And I would suggest that you grab the browser tab and the URL also, right, so I can see that. So just copy and paste that into your doc as well. And then finally, because we are creating a log file, I would also snip that. Doesn't have to be perfect, just so I get the idea that it's working for you and the logging is working, and then add that to your doc. The other thing that I would appreciate that you do, we really only wrote one code file here, but if it's only for the sake of backing up your stuff, right? Just let's say your system blows up, a bomb drops, and somebody grabs your laptops and makes a run for it. That you find the location where you are storing that, right? And for me, see if I can find it. Right? Here's my challenge. Is this where I'm storing it? 2024 summer, chapter 3. I would right click, compress that to a zip file and submit that as well. Chances are I probably won't run it. I'm just being real frank with you guys, unless I suspect something's wrong or you need help with it. But that also creates a backup for you guys, right? So that if you ever lose the work and you want it back, I have a way to get it back for you. So screenshots, zip file, turn it in on time. I'm not in a rush to get this right now. We're still kind of like spinning up a little bit, but next week we will move into chapter 4. So try to read that in advance, and we're going to plow through. That one's got a lot more coding examples in it, so we're going to start getting a lot busier, and we're going to feel the pace increase a little bit, right? And then as we move forward, but that'll be a good thing, right? The other heads up I will give you guys, and I'm going to stop the recording here. So this recording ends here. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.